So as a notice when doing this build and so following this tutorial, there are some warnings to give. To start with, there is the issue of static and handling PC parts. That's a big thing when assembling computers and touching other sort of electronics that are delicate to static discharge. When doing this sort of thing, you want to try and avoid as much carpet or rugs as possible, and if you are around them, and even if you aren't, it's still important to have something to avoid having that static discharge. And so in most builds, you'll see someone having something like this, and it's just a anti-static bracelet, and so it attaches to your body, makes a connection, and then you'll want to attach this somewhere metal on the computer, and it'll help protect that from that sort of situation. And another warning, there are a lot of sharp edges on motherboards, from components to just different faces to different parts, and so we have that. And when handling a motherboard, one of the things that will be really useful is an anti-static bracelet, because you don't want to fry anything on the motherboard. And so if you're around, say, like carpet or a rug even, or just anything where you could be getting up static, you're going to want to have one of these so you don't ruin anything. So to start with, we'll open up the PC case here. In many cases, you'll just have screws, one that a lot of the time that you can just take off and you can slide the case off. Or with a lot of modern cases, you'll have a latch mechanism where you can pull on a lever and it'll open up for no screw needed use openings. So in this case, it's just glass, tempered glass side, which you can set aside. And inside, you'll find the empty PC. It'll contain, a lot of the time, cable management holes. You probably can't tell, but there's a lot of different holes for different size motherboards. Depending on what you get, some will use some holes, others will not. And so for the purpose of this video, we're going to be using this motherboard and these cables here, which I'll point out what each of them is for, but indicated on a lot of them are labels. So you'll just end up matching those with whatever kind of motherboard you have. It should say on it. But when we get there, we'll have a look at those. Okay, for this next step of the build, what you're going to want to do is, if you have an anti-static bracelet, which is very recommended, you're going to want to attach it to a metal part of the PC case, which should help with grounding, so that way when you're handling the electronic components, such as the motherboard, it won't cause any issues to any components, won't mess up anything or break any of the parts. And so in our case here is the motherboard, and on this version, around it you'll see there are holes all around the surface that show where you're going to want to put your screws for your build. And so in this case, you can see there's a bunch of holes lying all around in here. You have these holes, there's also holes over here. They build a lot of different standoffs and other parts for you to set your motherboard on. And so not all holes you'll use. For your individual case, it will differ. But in this case, we'll show it going in and how it aligns up with some of these holes. And so in your build, whenever you insert the motherboard, just make sure to look where these holes are and see where it fits properly in the case, and where those holes will line up, and just screw it in those. And so what we'll want to start off is in your motherboard, or in your box, you'll get one of these. It won't come with the case. It'll come with the motherboard. It's an I/O shield, and what that part does is it will cover up this hole in the back where the motherboard connections will go. And so to do that, you just stick this back here. So we've inserted our I/O shield here. We popped it in. It required a good bit of force, so we just cut that out. And so now that that's in, and we have our motherboard, what we'll want to do is we'll want to open the other side of your case. In this one, it has a different type of screw mechanism. There's just thumb screws. And so then you can just slide off or pop off the side. A lot of time it'll just come sliding off. Now that the back is open, you can see a lot of screw holes, attachment bits for other parts of the case that we'll get around to. Here's all the cables, which we won't mess with here, at least not till we start plugging in them on this side. And so over here with the case, we have some other bits that we'll get to later. Here, for example, this is where we'll be installing some hard drives. And so in this one, they've just done some cardboard inserts. And these aren't going to matter at all. There's some screws in there, but just for that, we'll look around on this side. And so there's an introduction on this side. And so for now, we're not going to mess with those too much. But on this side here, we have it lifted. Now we have all the screws. And so what we're going to want to do is for here, we are going to move these out of the way and begin screwing in the motherboard. So for your own motherboard, this is where the bracelet will come in handy. But for your motherboard, there should be a bag of screws somewhere, most likely in the case or in the box. So in this case, we've installed the I/O panel and we've removed the other side of the case, which will allow us access to the other side of the motherboard. And so now we can get to the part of actually installing the full motherboard. Now, first what we'll want to do is, in your case, you want to look, and in here you can see there are these sticking out bits. These are standoffs. And what they'll allow us to do is, they'll allow the motherboard to sit in the case raised from the sides, so there's no connections between the motherboard and the metal frame of your case. And so for your individual motherboard, what we want to do is look where your holes are and see if those align with any standoffs currently in your case. And if there are any holes that don't align with what's in the case, then what you'll need to do is, for your motherboard or whatever comes with your case, find whatever extra standoffs it provides. This case in particular provides one extra standoff for any motherboards that have an extra hole. But in our case, we won't need it. And so what we'll do next is we'll install the motherboard using the screws that it provides. Now, the case will come with a series of screws, and you'll have to read your manual for this for the motherboard, but it should tell you what each kind of screw is for. And so in our case, we have here these screws that are slightly domed, and that's what we'll be putting in the motherboard. Now for this, we'll only need 9 screws, 3 for the top, 3 for the middle row, and 3 for this bottom row. And so very carefully, you want to make sure that bracelet on, you lift it up. You can just set it on here. Once again, it should be all right. Move any obstructions out of the way. And very carefully, lower the motherboard into your case. Okay, so to do the installation of the motherboard itself, what we're going to do is we're going to lift it up and over, stick it in very carefully to the case. Now, with some cases, especially the smaller ones, grabbing it is going to be an issue. So just as careful as possible, lift it in. For this next part, we're just going to install these screws for the standoffs. And so when you notice in here, there will be some spring pushing back. That's because the I/O shield comes with metal bits that stick out to apply some springiness to it and just to keep everything grabbed on. And so for this next part, you'll just take the screws that you have, just stick each of those in and screw them into the case. So now that we have the motherboard installed, here we have all our screws installed. And so next what we're going to want to do is we're going to want to start to install these fan and other sort of connectors for USB and other stuff. When you have your case, a lot of time it'll have case mount USB panels. So on the top here, we have USB panels and audio jack. And so all that will need to be connected to the motherboard through these here cables. And so we're going to start with is this connector. So this is a 3-pin fan connector. And so on your motherboard manual, you're going to want to read this through. just to know where each different connector goes, because some of them do have their own spots that are important. A lot of time the motherboard will list them. For some of the ones down here, we'll just connect them up with the cables up here. These cables here. And so for this here fan, in our example, we're going to be connecting this back fan just into a system fan slot. And we're leaving the cable ties on just because it keeps it neat and tidy. And we could route it somewhere else, but for now we'll just leave it here. And next what we'll start with is we're going to go with this USB 3.0 connector. And it's one of the easier ones because on the board itself, you'll notice there is a big connector. It's one of the ones with actual sides on it. And there'll be a notch on this connector. So you can quite easily just force it on. It requires a good bit of pressure, so do be careful about that. But once it seams all the way in, it should be fine. If not, don't force it too hard. You don't want to break anything. Then next, we will have here, on here it says audio. This will be for front panel audio. And so when you look on the motherboard itself, it should tell you exactly which one you want. This appears to be the audio one for this motherboard. And so here we will just stick this down and try and line that up, not missing any of the pins on it. Sometimes these cables will get twisted about because of how they're lined in shipping. And you can stick it on and it'll be all connected up with the pins. And so this part's done. We'll figure out cable routing later because you don't want just a mess of tangled wires like you have here. But for now, this is fine. And so we'll start doing with these other ones. This here will be another CPU fan, or another case fan. And so what we'll do with that is, you can just find an empty spot for it, like one of these. And you can just install it, slip it on here, and there's another case fan. Okay, so we've installed case fans here. We also have these case fan connectors, which I will route around these other cables so they don't get all tangled later. And with this one, you can just find where it says system fans. You can install them into those. Sometimes they're a bit hard to get into and reach around to. You install it there, and down here, there should also be a spot for a system fan. And if you just slide that around, find where the brackets line, because on here, there is 2 slots, and on the connector, it has 4 pins, but the slot that this slides into is towards the left. So that way, if you line this up, it won't let you stick it on the wrong way. You have to stick it on the correct way for these cases. So that one's on. And then next, for this specific case, we have a special connector. This is a weird one. It's for RGB. It doesn't have any sort of alignment slots. And so for this case, you have to just find where an RGB slot is. And or it'll be labeled RGB, or just it'll say 12V for 12 volt. And you want to stick that on. And so here we have found the 12 volt RGB connector. And so this one's a bit finicky because you have to line the holes up and it's not too well aligned. But on this one here, if you've noticed, it has an arrow pointing down right here towards where it goes. And so on the motherboard itself, you'll see that a lot of time it'll have a color code or just some sort of indicator to point that it is going down the right spot. And so after a little bit of just messing around, it'll take some time. You should be able to line those holes up and it should just go on. Okay, and so now that we have this RGB connector installed, what we'll go with next is the case buttons and the LED that'll show power for different parts of it. And so what you'll do on your motherboard is you'll look for a part that tells you where all the pins, and they should have them all labeled as to what is what. And so on this one, it'll show up here what it is. It has them labeled in really small text. And so you'll just find those on your motherboard and install them like that. These will be the LED on the front of the case to show that it's on. And it'll be really finicky because they're so small. They should go on. Then we will have the power switch. And this one doesn't matter too much for some cases, but just to be safe, you just want to follow what it says. And so it'll tell you sometimes positive, negative, but really if your switch on your specific case doesn't have it labeled, or on the motherboard it just doesn't have it labeled, or the case it doesn't have it labeled, just stick it on. It shouldn't really matter. Then you're going to want to put, this is the reset switch. And that will go, since it's not labeled on here, it doesn't matter. And that will go right below this one here. Sometimes the order you install it will help a lot. And you can see where having this anti-static will help a lot because you're going real close to the motherboard, and that can cause some issues. And so we'll stick this on, and that should be all the LEDs you'll have. Now, sometimes you'll have more. These are all connected. There's also one for a hard drive LED, so we'll see if they have one on here. Some cases, modern ones at least, will not have them. And if not, then you don't have to worry about it. But it seems here we don't. So that should take care of all the computer case plugins. And so you don't have to worry about doing anything else with those until we get to until you eventually do a power supply, which we won't be covering here. But when you do, on your motherboard, you'll see different slots for your motherboard to have power supply connections in, and you can mess with those when you get around to that. Now, finally, once you have all these done, sometimes you can save this for once you fully finished with all the cabling, but you'll want to do cable management just to help with airflow of the PC case, because that can be very important. And so for cables like this, you can route them in different ways. And here, these came through this slot, but you can move them up here, for example. But in this one, what we'll most likely do is we'll just shove these through a little bit more, route it in the back here, and just cable tie these up, so that way they're not in the way. And so some cases or motherboards will come with these ties, and you'll just use those, stick them around whatever cable you want, stick that in, you can just pull it through. It's like a regular zip tie, just small for case screws, or for cases. And so you should just be able to use that. So what we'll mess with next is we're going to be installing those hard drives I mentioned earlier. First, we're going to start with the SSD, because it's one of the easier parts of this whole build. Or it can be the hardest, it depends on how this wall is going to fit. But it'll be real small, super small sized. And the way this is going to install is on this motherboard, it comes with these brackets here. And these are going to require a screwdriver. But it's going to come with these brackets here. Some of them are easily to mount. Some of them just require a mechanism where it sort of snaps in place and you just sort of install the thing. On this one, it will require you to screw it out. We have our SSD. It's small, and in this case, it'll be different for different motherboard, or for different cases. But we have these brackets here. They just slide in and have a screw, and so you can thumb tighten these. But to start with, we had to use a screwdriver because it's from the factory. And so the way this will install is there are 4 screw holes on here and then 4 on this installation bay. And to install this, you're just going to take the screws that will be listed in your case manual that it supplies, or your motherboard, most likely your case for this part. You'll take the screws it says is our 4 SSDs, and you'll just install those 4, and they should just screw in real easy like this. And so now that we have the screws installed for this SSD, properly tighten them, you can by hand just find where this is and just thumb tighten it, so that way in the future you won't have to bring out a screwdriver or anything if you need to replace these. And so we don't have the other part of this for this build, which will be the power supply. There's a connector that goes here. But for this one, what you'll do is you'll get a SATA cable, which comes a lot of time with the hard drives, and you will find where it lines up in the SSD. There will be 2. There's a small part and a big part, and the small part is where the SSD connector will go. They can be very fumbly, but once you found it, they'll just snap right in, And so here we've installed the SSD with the 4 screws, and we've just hand tightened this screw in so that way we can remove it again in the future in case if your case ends up being similar, you can remove the SSD without having to pull out another screwdriver and make a hassle. And so for now, you'll just want to do a SATA cable like this. They should come with the SSD, and if not, you can get them online. And you'll thread the cable through here for us. And on the motherboard itself, there will be something like these, but for our particular use, or for this particular one here, what we'll do is we'll go for these 2 lower connectors because it's out of the way. And the way you'll just do it similar with the ones in the actual hard drive, just find where it lines up. And sometimes that can be finicky, but find when that lines up, and you can just stick it in with pretty much ease. And so now that's in, and you can write your cables around for cable management however you want. For the next part of the build, we have the hard drive here. It'll be good for just hard storage and anything that needs to be not kept on the SSD. And so down in this case, like many others, you just pinch these 2 here and it'll slide out. This is very similar for a lot of hard drive cases, so for easy just insertion and desertion. And the way you'll install this on this case, on the sides you'll have these holes, and so you will want to align those. So probably the easiest way to do it is just to find where those holes are, sort of not stretch it, but bend it just a tiny bit because it is plastic, and then find where those holes are and let it pop in. And so here we have the hard drive, which we'll be installing to add just larger storage capacity, which is a bit slower than this SSD. And so on this case, it comes with these bays, which slot into the drive cage here. And the way that works is there are these 4 nubs that stick out, and there's 4 holes on the sides of these hard drives. And so optionally, you can add screws to these bays, and what that'll do is it'll just really hard mount these hard drives into these cages. This is optional in cases that have these nubs, these little bits that stick out, because those will go into the hard drive and keep it tightly mounted. And now that we have these screws installed, we'll just show how easy it is to insert these. Find where it will slide in, and just stick it in. Sometimes it'll do the case. These will go in, so now the hard drive is securely in. We'll stick this in again. And now this is in, and so on there you can visibly see there is another SATA cable. And so what you'll want to do is we'll want to take another cable connector like we did for the SSD. We'll stick it on through the cable management holes. And so you see it there. And on this side, we'll once again find where this connects and stick it on like this. It's really tight. And you stick it on like this. It'll come on through and go through to the other side. And now on this side, what we'll do once again is we will find a SATA connector that we can just stick this on. What we'll do is we'll go for one of these lower connectors again, because there's 2, and we'll angle it around to where this is facing upwards. Slide it on around. You can pop it into the connector. And now that's in, and now that's the installation of the hard drive. And so to finish those off, what you'd want to do is have a power supply mounted in this part of the case. And those would have different cables that slot through here and come and connect to here. You could probably come through this side of it, but depending on how big your power supply is. And so this matches this goes with these cables. And so once again, you can just manage these like you would with the other ones, slide them up. And there are, if you have extra, you can use these case ties to find a place to mount them. A lot of cases will have these built-in brackets to do cable management. And so depending on how you want to angle it, you can thread them through certain angles. And here, we'll just sort of push these to the side like this and slide a tie through around here. And this will just make it easier. I rotate it around after that, so that way we're getting the proper side. And now You'll take your cables, stick them through, and just tie them up. And so once you have your SSDs installed, your motherboard's all ready, your all cables are where you want them, you can cover up the back of the computer case again, and we'll just do what we did before. Sometimes aligning these can be really finicky, but sometimes it just lines up perfectly. And so once you have those in, everything you want, sometimes if you feel around this edge, be bold just so you know it's not on properly. So once that happens, you just slide it back off, press it in some points, and then slide it back on in a way that you feel is flat. That's on. This looks to be all the way on. And to get that fully tightened on, you can just put these screws in. And if you don't think you're going to open this for a while, sometimes doing the screws with your thumbs will just be fine, so that way you can open it up again. But if you're worried for how like the case is fitting or anything, you can just tighten it on with a screwdriver. A lot of times these will be threaded or slotted for screwdrivers. Once again, earlier we did that. And so you can just tighten that on. And now the back plate is back on. That part is covered. Everything else is almost covered. Now the only part remaining is this front part. If you had other connections or parts to attach, you would put them in and before this front's on. But now that's all done, you can take whatever front plate you had and reattach that back onto the front. And especially for some cases, these will be made of glass, like this one. So tighten it too much can be dangerous to it. So it's good just to tighten it with your fingers. And that is everything you need to install a motherboard, a hard drive, and hard drives into a PC case. And so once again, a lot of this will be very different depending on what version, sort of model you might have of a PC case, or what types of hard drives you got, what type of motherboard you got. But generally for the sort of common use items, a regular SSD, a hard drive, those connectors will be the same for motherboards, and for fans, for other case parts, those will be the same. So overall, just want to make sure to look at your manual a little bit, know on your motherboard where the connectors are, and so you can easily just get those brought over and connected together.